It was a humid morning, and the heavy air seemed to hint at an impending rainstorm. George, an 82-year-old war veteran, was walking slowly through the park, his breath labored with each step. Beside him, Toby, a short-haired, brown mutt, followed loyally, despite his thin frame, which spoke of years of hardship, and a slight limp in his hind leg. Toby walked with his head held high, as if every step reflected his unwavering devotion to his owner. George wore his beige shirt adorned with medals of honor, and his distant gaze seemed fixed on a past only he could understand. Emily was sitting on a nearby bench with a group of friends. Young, around 25, with bright eyes and an easy laugh. She paid little attention to the man walking by until she heard a mean remark from one of her friends. "Look at that worn-out dog. I bet he won't last much longer," the guy said, laughing loudly. Emily laughed too, but added something even crueler. Not considering the impact of her words, "Maybe it's time to let that old dog rest. He looks more like a burden than a companion." George heard it. He stopped, not out of anger, but because of something much deeper, a weariness that didn't come just from the walk. With a sigh, he bent down slowly and stroked Toby's head. The dog seemed to understand the weight of that humiliation. For a moment, the park fell completely silent. George's eyes didn't lift to confront the young people. Instead, he stayed there, caressing his dog, as if Toby alone was worthy of his words. "You've done more for me than anyone could ever imagine, boy." Emily noticed the gesture, and for some reason she couldn't understand. It bothered her. What did he mean by it? Something about the scene. The old man with a melancholic gaze and the dog so clearly marked by time stirred something within her that she couldn't explain. Her friends, still laughing, suddenly felt as emotionally distant as she had ever realized. Emily began to feel uncomfortable, but her pride wouldn't let her stand up just yet. When George sat on a nearby bench and Toby lay down beside him, panting but alert, Emily realized she could no longer ignore them. That pair, so unlikely, carried a connection that seemed impossible to explain with just a glance. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, Emily got up and began to approach, leaving her friends' laughter behind. What Emily was about to hear about George and Toby wouldn't just change the way she saw them. It would also transform her understanding of the true meaning of sacrifice and loyalty. Emily walked slowly toward George, feeling each step weigh more than the last. Toby, lying beside the bench, lifted his head and watched her with tired but attentive eyes. George didn't move. He simply kept petting the dog, as if he already knew someone was coming. When Emily got closer, she hesitated, noticing up close the dull shine of the medals on the veteran's chest, and the marks of a life spent in battle on his trembling hands. "Your dog. He seems special," Emily began, trying to hide the discomfort in her voice. George slowly lifted his eyes, meeting hers. His gaze was heavy, but there was no anger there, only a silence that seemed to hold years of stories no one bothered to listen to. He gave a faint, ironic and tired smile as he ran his hand over Toby's neck. "More than special, miss. He's the reason I'm still here." Emily furrowed her brow, surprised. Something in her curiosity overcame the initial discomfort. She sat next to him, keeping a respectful distance but not looking away. "What makes him so special?" she asked, her voice softer this time. George sighed, looking off into the distance, as if seeing something far beyond the park's horizon. He began to speak, and his voice, though quiet, was full of emotion. "I found Toby 7 years ago. I was going through one of the worst times in my life. I lost my wife, and, to be honest, I lost the will to go on too. I was sitting on the porch floor, holding a glass of bourbon and wondering if it was even worth continuing. Then he showed up." George paused, looking at the dog now sleeping beside him. Skinny, dirty, nearly dead, but he had the same thing in his eyes that I felt. A cry for help. Emily swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. She looked at Toby, who now seemed even more fragile under this new light. "Did you take him in?" she asked, almost whispering. George nodded slowly. "I took him in, but he saved me first. When I saw how he fought to keep going, Even with such a weak body, I realized I didn't have the right to give up. He was a nobody, a mutt no one paid attention to. But he was there, fighting to live. Emily felt a wave of emotions wash over her. But George hadn't told her the whole story yet. What happened to Toby afterward, and what those medals really meant, was something she wasn't ready to hear yet. Emily couldn't hide the impact of George's words. There was something in his voice that seemed to scratch directly at her heart, as if each sentence carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Looking at Toby, lying peacefully next to his owner, she began to see him in a different light. He wasn't just a humble-looking dog. There was something magnificent about that simple creature. George continued, his eyes now slightly shining with the memory. I brought him home that night, not knowing if he'd survive. He was so weak he couldn't even eat properly. I stayed up all night taking care of him, trying to keep him warm. And, even in that state, he looked at me like he was thanking me. Not like a desperate animal, but like someone who knew what I was doing for him. Emily felt the lump in her throat tighten. It was hard to imagine how much those two had helped each other. George noticed her gaze and gave a bitter smile. For weeks, I fed him with the little I had. I even sold one of my medals to pay for the vet. He needed serious care. But against all odds, Toby survived. He paused, gently petting the sleeping dog, and as he grew stronger, something inside me began to change too. What do you mean? Emily asked, leaning a little closer, as if every word he spoke was an invisible thread pulling her into the heart of the story. George looked at her, and for the first time, a genuine smile formed on his lips. He brought me back to life, little lady. Before Toby, I spent my days alone, dwelling on the memories of what I lost. My wife, my friends, the things I saw during the war. But Toby didn't let me give up. He needed me, and because of that, I kept going. He became my purpose, my family. Emily felt the tears starting to form but tried to hide them. There was something so powerful in the simplicity of their bond. George seemed to notice the impact of his words. But instead of stopping, he continued, as if revealing the most important chapter of his life. George paused for a moment, but his eyes indicated there was more. The connection between him and Toby was deep, but the story still held an unexpected twist, something Emily was about to discover. George remained silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the slow movement of the tree leaves above them. Emily felt the pause like a weight in the air, as if he was about to reveal something he had been carrying for years. Finally, he took a deep breath and began to pet Toby, who was now awake, watching the veteran as if sensing the gravity of the moment. The truth, young lady, is that Toby didn't just save me emotionally. He literally saved my life, George began, his voice now deeper and slower. 3 years after he came into my life, I ended up in the hospital. Weak heart, they said. My age and the stress had caught up with me. Emily's eyes widened, surprised. George continued, his hand never leaving Toby's fur. I was alone back then. I had no one to visit me. But Toby, he stopped, smiling tenderly at the dog. He would stay by the door of the room, as if he knew something was wrong. He wouldn't even eat properly. Then one night I had a heart attack. I was alone at home, and the world started to go dark. I thought it was the end. Emily held her breath. The story seemed more intense with every word. But Toby didn't leave me. He started barking loud, non-stop. He scratched the door so hard that a neighbor came to check. When they opened the door and found me, I was already unconscious. If he hadn't done that, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Emily felt the tears silently stream down her face. Toby, who once seemed like just any stray dog, now had an almost heroic aura in her eyes. He gave me life twice, young lady. Once, he brought me back from emotional darkness, and another time, from death itself. So when someone looks at him like he's worth nothing, I just smile. Because I know that without him, I wouldn't be here. Emily looked at Toby, and for the first time, she felt ashamed of how she had judged the dog. He wasn't just a simple-looking dog. He was a symbol of resilience, love, and loyalty. George looked at Emily with a more serious gaze. But that's not all, young lady. There's something else about Toby, something I didn't even fully understand. Until recently, Emily couldn't contain her curiosity. George's last sentence seemed to echo in her mind, leaving her restless. What more could there be to the story of that dog? She looked at Toby, who appeared relaxed, but his bright eyes stared back at her as if holding a secret of his own. "What do you mean by something else?" Emily asked, leaning in closer, not realizing that her tone had shifted from disdain to genuine concern. George let out a long sigh before continuing. "After Toby saved me that night, I started noticing something strange about him. It wasn't just his intelligence, you know? It was like he always knew what I needed, even before I did. When I was sad, he'd stay by my side, but not in an obvious way. He just knew the exact moment to get closer. When I was in danger, he'd act without hesitation, as if he could predict the future." Emily furrowed her brow, intrigued. It was as if George was describing some sort of inexplicable connection between them. He continued, now with a slightly lower voice, as if afraid of sounding ridiculous. "There was one night, about 2 months ago, when I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know why, but something felt wrong. When I got up, I saw Toby standing at the door, staring intently at the hallway. It was like he was waiting for something." George's story grew even more intense, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "I followed Toby to the room, and as soon as I got there, I heard the sound of glass breaking. Someone was trying to break in through the window. Before I could react, Toby had already run to the kitchen, catching the intruder by surprise. He scared him so much that the man ran off, leaving everything behind." Emily was speechless. Toby wasn't just loyal. He seemed to have an almost supernatural perception of things around him. She looked back at the dog, who now rested his head on his paws, as if none of it was extraordinary. George gazed deeply into Emily's eyes before finishing. "But you know, young lady, the strangest thing happened the next day. The neighbor who came to help me that night showed me something I still don't understand. Something that might explain why Toby came into my life." Emily leaned forward, barely containing her tension. George seemed distant for a moment, as if reliving what he was about to tell. He stroked Toby's fur, and the dog raised his head and looked at him, as if he knew that this part of the story was his too. "That morning, the neighbor knocked on my door holding something in his hands," George began, his voice low. "It was an old leash, covered in dirt, which he found in the yard while checking if the intruder had left anything behind. He said it looked like it belonged to Toby. But when I looked closer, I realized I'd never seen that leash before." Emily's eyes widened, trying to make sense of it. George continued, pausing as if choosing each word carefully. "The leash was different, sweetheart. It was worn out, but you could still read the engraving on it. And that's what froze me. Right there, it clearly said, 'Property of Sergeant William H. Carter.'" Emily blinked, confused. "And who is William H. Carter?" George gave a melancholic smile, his eyes drifting to the horizon. "He was my best friend in the army. We fought side by side in several battles. He was a man of courage, but he never came home. During a mission, he disappeared. We searched for days but never found anything. To this day, he's considered missing in action." Emily's heart seemed to race as she processed what she just heard. "But how is that possible? How could Toby have something that belonged to your friend?" she asked, feeling a lump form in her throat. George shook his head slowly, as if he himself was still struggling to understand. "That's the question I ask myself every day. Ever since I saw that collar, I can't get it out of my head. Toby came into my life in an inexplicable way, and now this." He looked at the dog, who almost seemed human in his calm expression. "It's like he was sent by someone, young lady. Someone who knew I needed him." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, and before she could ask more questions, George leaned closer to her and said something that made the air around them feel even heavier. "But that's not all. There's something about the night I found Toby that I've never told anyone. Not even him." George seemed to hesitate. His hand trembled slightly as he stroked Toby, as if gathering the courage to share what he had been holding inside was as difficult as reliving that moment. Emily leaned in even closer, feeling the tension rise with every second of silence. "I never talked about this because I thought no one would believe me," he began, his voice hoarse. "That night, when I first met Toby, it wasn't just him saving me from danger. Like I told you before, there was something different." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. "Different how?" George looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I was at the park, like I said, feeling lost, but there was something strange in the air. It was so cold, colder than usual for that time of year, and the silence, it was so deep that even my footsteps seemed to be swallowed by nothingness. That's when I heard a sound, something that sounded like a call. It wasn't a dog's bark. It was more like a mournful cry." He paused, his eyes lost in the memory. "I followed the sound, even though my stomach was in knots, and then I saw him. Toby was standing in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by mist that seemed to rise from the ground. He didn't move until I was close enough. His eyes locked onto mine in a way I'll never forget. It was like he was waiting for me." Emily held her breath, completely absorbed in what she was hearing. "When I knelt down to touch him, I noticed he was holding something in his mouth. It was a medal, one of those we give to soldiers in the army. And do you know what was engraved on it? William's name." The shock hit Emily like a punch. "Your friend's medal?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. George nodded, his eyes shining with something between fear and reverence. "His medal, the one that disappeared with him years ago. How did it end up there? How did Toby find it? These questions still haunt me, but one thing I know, he didn't come to me by chance." George lowered his head, his voice almost a murmur. "And there's more. That same night, after I took Toby home, I had a dream I still can't explain, but it might be the key to understanding all of this." The afternoon was slowly passing by, and the silence between George and Emily was heavy with meaning. The tension in the air was almost tangible. But George knew that in order to fully understand Toby's story, he had to reveal what he had been keeping for years. That night, after taking Toby home, George began, his voice low and steady. "I had a dream, but it wasn't an ordinary dream. It was something more. I found myself in a battlefield, but it was unlike any I had ever been to. It was as if everything around me was made of memories. The sounds, the images, even the smell of wet earth felt like a mix of the past and the present." Emily kept her eyes fixed on him, feeling every word as if she were part of that experience. George paused, running his hand through Toby's fur, as if the dog's touch gave him the strength to continue. "In the middle of that field was William," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "He didn't look like I remember him in my last days with him, but like he was at his prime. Confident, determined. He smiled at me, as if he knew I was struggling to understand what was happening." Toby lifted his head, almost as if he could feel the intensity of George's memories. Emily held her breath, not daring to interrupt. "He said, George, I could never come back, but now it's different. He's my way of taking care of you, just like you took care of me." George paused, his eyes filling with tears. "And then he disappeared. The fog around me started to fade, and I found myself holding William's medal." Emily felt a shiver run through her body. She looked at Toby, who remained calm, as if he were the anchor of the story, the centerpiece of something much bigger than she could understand. "Did you wake up with the medal?" Emily asked, barely able to control her curiosity. George nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the horizon. "It was there, beside Toby on the ground. I don't know how it got there. Maybe I'll never know. But from that moment, I knew Toby was more than just a dog. He was a gift, a bridge between what I lost and what I could still build." Emily could hardly believe what she was hearing, but at the same time, she couldn't find any reason to doubt it. The connection between George, William, and Toby was deeper and more mysterious than she had ever imagined. George looked at her, his eyes tired but filled with determination. "I don't expect you to understand or believe, young lady. I just want you to know that, to me, Toby is not just a mutt. He's the reason I'm still here, living and fighting." Emily felt a single tear slide down her cheek. George's story wasn't just about losses and reunions, but about the transformative power of loyalty and love. George sighed deeply before continuing, and that wasn't the last time I felt William's presence, nor the impact Toby had on my life. Emily held her breath. The story was far from over, and something told her that what was coming next would be even more intense. George settled into the bench as if preparing to continue the story took all his strength. Emily, now completely captivated, waited anxiously, trying to understand how such a deep bond between man and dog could be even more extraordinary. Toby, in turn, stayed still but alert, as if he knew the moment was important. A year ago, George began, his voice a little rougher. My health worsened again. The doctors said my heart was weakening, and I might not have much time left. It was a tough period, but I had Toby with me, and as always, he seemed to know what was going on before I even realized. Emily leaned forward, paying attention to every word. The tension in George's words was almost tangible, and the silence of the park around them seemed to amplify the impact of his story. One night, I started to feel really bad. It was different from all the times before. The chest pain was so intense that I collapsed to the floor. I knew I wouldn't be able to call anyone, but before I could even try, Toby was already in action. He barked, ran to the door, and started scratching with all his might. Emily felt her heart tighten. Every detail of George's account seemed to highlight Toby's heroism, something she would never have noticed when she first looked at him. Fortunately, one of my neighbors heard the desperate barking. He came to my house and found the door slightly open. Toby had pulled the lever with his teeth, something I had never taught him. The neighbor called the ambulance, and they arrived in time to save me. If it weren't for him, Emily... George paused, looking at Toby with a mix of gratitude and reverence. I wouldn't be here now. Emily swallowed hard, trying to hold back her tears. She looked at Toby, and once again felt ashamed of how she had judged him at first. That simple dog had done things that few people would be capable of. He was more than loyal. He was a guardian, a companion in the deepest sense of the word. Toby saved me again, young lady, and that only reinforced what I already knew. He's not just a dog. He was sent to me, I have no doubt about that. But the strangest part of all is still to come, George concluded, looking directly into Emily's eyes, making it clear that the next chapter of his story would be the most surprising. George sighed deeply, as if gathering the courage to tell what remained of the story was a battle in itself. Emily was now completely engrossed. Every word from George seemed to carry an almost mystical weight. Toby, always calm and serene, seemed to understand that this was the most important moment. Not long after Toby saved me that night, something unbelievable happened. George began, his voice steady but with a tone of reverence. I was organizing some old papers, things I had kept from my days in the army, and things of William's too. That's when I found a photo. Emily raised an eyebrow, intrigued, but remained silent so he could continue. George pulled something from his jacket pocket, an old, yellowed photo, which he handed to her. This photo was taken just before our last mission. It was me, William, and his dog, a mutt he found while we were at the base. William loved that dog. He called him Toby. Emily held the photo in her hands, her eyes wide. The resemblance was unmistakable. The dog in the picture had the same piercing eyes and the same serene posture as Toby. It was as if time had not passed for him. But, this is impossible, Emily said, looking at George, unsure how to process what she was seeing. George nodded slowly, a small melancholic smile forming on his face. I know. I didn't believe it at first either. But what else could explain everything? The way he showed up, William's medal, and now this photo. It's like he was sent to me, not just as a companion, but as a living reminder of my friend. Emily felt a lump in her throat. It all made sense, yet at the same time it felt impossible to believe. She looked at Toby, who was now watching her with his expressive, almost human-like eyes, as if he knew he was the center of that mystery. I don't know how or why this happened, young lady, George said, his voice trembling. But I know what I've felt since the moment I found Toby. He brought back something I thought I had lost forever. The connection with someone who meant everything to me." George looked back at Toby, his hand gently resting on the dog's head. "He's my friend, my savior, and maybe in some way I'll never understand a part of William." Emily felt tears silently rolling down her face as she handed the photo back to George. There was an indescribable peace in that moment. As if, at last, the story had come full circle. She knew she would never look at the bond between humans and animals the same way again.